Dr. Catherine Rees. Okay. Before the speech, I have this opportunity to introduce her. Catherine Rees joined Loughborough University in 2007, straight after her PhD at Aberystwyth University, which focused on the playwright Martin McDonagh. She is program leader for MA Theatre, and her main research activity is in the field of contemporary British and Irish theatre. She has published widely on the plays and films of Martin McDonagh, and also on the works of Harold Pinter and Sarah Kane. Her main research interest is in theatre and gender, nationalism, political theatre, and applied theatre. She's the author of 3 monographs on theatre and adaptation, the plays of Harold Pinter, and contemporary British drama, and is currently preparing a 4th monograph on the topic of Martin McDonagh for Routledge. And her work in applied theatre includes working on interdisciplinary projects with external partners to explore the effectiveness of applied approaches to eating behavior, typically under 18s and older adults. Quite interesting. And the title of her presentation is Statues, Culture Wars, and Graffiti, Adaptation in Practice in Contemporary Society. I think first of all, welcome, Catherine Rees. Thank you for joining us. I heard that you are not well today. I hope you recover soon.
Thank you for that very kind and generous introduction, and thank you for chairing today. I wanted to say hello to you all. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to the organising team, and I hope you're all very much enjoying the conference. Yeah, I'm just recovering from a nasty cold, so I don't have much voice. So thankfully, you're going to watch a pre-recorded video, but I am here, and hopefully my Wi-Fi will enable me to chat with you briefly at the end as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we can start the presentation.
Of course. Of course.
Thank you very much.
Hello there, everyone. Hopefully this is recording and you can hear me. Hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm very pleased to be with you, albeit virtually and pre-recorded. My name is Catherine Rees. I'm Senior Lecturer in Drama at Loughborough University in the UK. My main research interests are in contemporary British and Irish theatre, perhaps most predominantly the playwright and filmmaker Martin McDonagh, although my research field is currently expanding to explore some applied theatre practices, particularly in connection to health, well-being and medicine. I think, however, that I was invited to speak with you today because of a book that I wrote in 2017 called Adaptation and Nation, Theatrical Contexts for Contemporary English and Irish Drama. And should you wish to get hold of a copy, that's what it looks like. The premise of this book was to examine, often through close reading of one translated text alongside another, adaptations that have been shifted by a contemporary dramatist from one national context to another. So, for example, Brian Friel's translations of Chekhov from the original Russian to an Irish setting, to arguably an Irish setting anyway. Other examples that I explored were contemporary reimaginings of Roman and Greek classical theatre, for example, Kane's Phaedra's Love or Marina Carr's Ariel and By the Bog of Cats. Ultimately, the point of that book was to ask why a playwright might choose to adapt an existing text rather than start writing a new play from scratch. The conclusion I reached in this book was that playwrights rely on pre-existing knowledge about classical texts to build part of the new story that they want to tell. They use the original text as the foundations for their new houses. They need the audience to appreciate and to recognise the first text as the scaffold underpinning and supporting a new extension of a later and original story. In adopting a new national context, they are then able to comment on the political and social conditions of their new story, but again through the lens of the earlier play. So, for example, Cain's royal family in Phaedra's Love adopts the tone of a Roman tragedy, and yet is also reminiscent of the 1990s Windsor royal family in the UK. They experience dysfunctional family relationships, divorces, infidelities, scandals, and ultimately the untimely death of the princesses. So when I first thought about what I was going to say for this keynote, the key question that kept coming into my mind was, how can we understand textual adaptation in our contemporary times? So rather than looking back at original stories and texts, I instead wanted to reflect on a suitable image for how I believe adaptation works in our lives today. And one key image was very much part of answering this question, and it's one that I'll share with you towards the end of this presentation. I'll come back to that one before too long. But first, let's all think about how we understand adaptation. We're probably all familiar with Linda Hutchins' famous repetition with variation definition. In working with this definition, this phrase helps us posit one version alongside the other. They do not completely overlap in that there must be some identifiable variation, but there must also be a closeness between the two sources. There must be sufficient repetition for an audience to see that the two texts or performances are linked and connected in some fundamental way. For me, there must be a visual way to depict this. Perhaps you might imagine a classic Venn diagram, and here's one I've prepared for you. Two circles representing the two or more iterations of the story. So here is the variation, with a section in the middle representing the common ground, which is the repetition. I'm probably more interested in historical examples though, so I'll share these images, some images in a minute, to further understand how I believe adaptation works. So let's have a look. This is the Devil's Bridge in West Wales, what's known as the Devil's Bridge in West Wales, near the town of Aberystwyth. This image clearly shows us three distinct bridges, each more modern than the one that came before. We can clearly see layers of history, one bridge appearing above the other. What's important is that the first bridge, the earliest bridge, is not obliterated. It's still clearly visible. So here's your repetition with variation. The bridges are repetitious in that all three serve the same function of bridging the gap between the two sides of the gorge. And yet there is also clear variation. The bridges are not the same. They are different shapes, they come from different historical periods, and they're made from different materials. Here's another example for you to have a look at. This is the Roman lighthouse at Dover Castle in the UK. It's the oldest surviving lighthouse in the country. The bottom section is the original Roman structure. The top section is medieval. It's the impression of a bell tower. And so the older original is still visible beneath the more modern adaptation. In fact, you might say it serves as the foundations for the later adaptation. I say original as if that is straightforward. I know, of course, that it is not. What does it mean to speak of something being original? In performance, we could argue that nothing is original. The nature of live performance means that every script is being reinterpreted and adapted every time it is performed anew. If live performance values the ephemeral, the fact that it cannot be recorded or permanently captured, as Peggy Phelan might argue, we could suggest that in the moment of performance, texts are always being adapted, as no two performances are exactly the same. Similarly, I think we also agree that texts and stories are rarely ever originals. Many stories are versions of earlier tales. Cinderella has resonances of King Lear. The Lion King draws on Hamlet. We know that West Side Story is a version of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which is in itself a version of an earlier well-known poem. The plague that ravishes Thebes in Oedipus Rex is echoed in Ibsen's The Enemy of the People, Ionesco's Rhinoceros, and the Pied Piper of Hamelin. So we should be cautious about referring to any text or performance as original. To quote now from a completely unrelated volume, I was reading recently the excellent murder mystery novel Murder Before Evensong by the wonderful Reverend Richard Coles. And this particular passage struck me in relation to adaptation, and I quote, "What is an original text? What the author wrote down, the first draft, the final draft, the version that went into the canon. Once I had stopped looking for the original version, the whole thing opened up to me like a flower, and I started asking more interesting questions." And yet the term original and originality may unfortunately be considered a necessary evil in discussing adaptation. So first, a question. What is adaptation in the 21st century? I want to try and answer that question, or at least think about it in a different way, by placing adaptation alongside our contemporary cultural experience. In this case, the culture wars. How do we get from thinking about staging adaptations of plays to the controversial so-called culture wars? Well, hopefully I will explain. But first, I wanted to reflect for a moment on a play that helps bridge that gap. And that play is Patrick Marber's Don Juan in Soho. Okay, so Don Juan in Soho premiered at the Donmar Warehouse in London in 2006. It was directed by Munkel Grandage and starred Rees Evans as the eponymous Don Juan, or DJ, as he's described in Marber's play. Of course, this play is clearly signalled to the audience as an adaptation. That's there in the very title. The Don Juan legend has been retold, adapted, and transformed many times over the centuries. It began as a tale written by a Spanish monk in 1630. This story was created with a specific didactic purpose, depicting the life and death of Don Juan Toriano, intended to serve as a warning to the audience against immoral ways of life. Over the centuries, the myth developed into other genres, most notably Mozart's opera Don Giovanni in 1787 and Byron's epic poem Don Juan in 1819. The character of Don Juan also features in Albert Camus' essay on absurdism, The Myth of Sisyphus, from 1955, as he describes the endless cycle of Don Juan's quest for new lovers to be emblematic of the absurd, as the character endlessly searches for but more, but one more, but one more love affair. Depiction of the myth has been dominant in the theatre, though, and Marber's play is most closely related to the 1665 version of the story by Molière. By the time Molière writes his version of the myth in 17th century France, his moral message is rather more ambiguous than the earlier morality tales. Translator Ian MacLean writes that Molière himself claims, quote, "A comic playwright should address himself to the specific vices and follies of," in italics, "his own age." This suggests that in appropriating the Don Juan myth, Molière sought to use it to illuminate concerns and problems of his own time, most specifically the bourgeois aristocracy of 17th century France. In most of the variations of this mythic tale, the basic elements remain basically the same. In case you're unfamiliar with the story, I'll recount it briefly here now. Don Juan is depicted as a roguish young man, ruthlessly and dishonestly seducing a number of women with an insatiable desire. In most versions of the tale, he is accompanied by a despairing servant who acts at times as a narrator, filling in the action for the audience, and also, although this role varies through history, as the moral counterpoint to Don Juan, a kind of everyman figure. Who serves the function of attempting to right the wrongs of Don Juan's behaviour. This role developed into a more comic one over time, which we see exploited in Marber's 21st century version of the tale. At the outset of the Molière play, Don Juan has seduced Elvira, a would-be nun, and he has married her. He immediately loses interest and abandons her to seek new conquests. Don Juan now plans to seduce a new mistress and attempts to intercept a boat in which she is travelling. When the boat sinks, Don Juan and his servant are rescued, and two women compete for Don Juan's love. He promises marriage to both. Don Juan learns that Elvira's brothers wish to kill him in revenge for abandoning their sister. In disguise, Don Juan saves a man from a violent attack who turns out to be one of the brothers. He then comes upon the statue and tomb of a commander that he has previously killed. He invites the statue to dinner, and the statue accepts by nodding his head. Don Louis, Don Juan's father, appears to try and persuade his son to live a more noble existence. Feigning repentance and religion, Don Juan persuades his father that he has seen the error of his ways. The statue appears in time for dinner, and taking Don Juan by the hand, drags him to hell. His assistant is left complaining he's still owed wages. Marber's adaptation of the Don Juan myth, Don Juan in Soho, self-consciously relocates the action in a completely different national context, that of 21st century London. As I argued in the book I mentioned earlier, this shift in location is crucial in how we approach the play. London has a rich history of literary representation, enjoying both numerous depictions in literature, theatre and other arts, as well as housing prominent writers throughout history. Marber's choice of location for his adaptation is the district of Soho, enclosed within Oxford Street, Regent Street, Covent Garden and Leicester Square in the heart of the city centre. As noted in the play, the origins of this name come from the call of the huntsman who originally rode through the fields, although the area is now, of course, much more infamously known for its high quantity of sex shops, strip clubs and prostitution. Of course, the raffish nature of this London district is utilised by Marber to further the myth of Don Juan as a predatory and prolific lover, as well as a bon vivant in the tradition of fine dining. Soho also enjoys a rich history of illustrious residents, including Mozart, Shelley, De Quincey, Marx, and that other notable Lothario Casanova. Interestingly, many point to the influx of French immigrants in the 17th century as an instigator of the district's reputation as fashionably foreign and bohemian. And these French connections also help inform a reading of Marber's play as being a reworking of Molière's French comedy, providing tangible links between the national context of the original and the chosen new location for the adaptation. Marber's relocation can thus be read as a knowing nod towards the French original. As the concerns of the age shift, so does the location and setting. Whilst Molière's play is set in a variety of locations around Sicily, Marber's adaptation lives quite definitely in London and more specifically in Soho. As I've explained, this setting, this specific location, offers Marber a kind of theatrical shorthand. None of his audience would be unaware of the district's reputation for sexual licentiousness, and so this serves as the ideal home for a London-based Don Juan. The city location also helps establish DJ, as he's known in this play, as a flaneur, wandering around the cityscape while remaining emotionally detached from his environment. When DJ proclaims, quote, "I love this city, I love all cities," and the accompanying stage direction reads, "They gaze for a while, a moment of intense joy," it is this image of the idle urban voyager, I think, that we are being asked to see. This connection between London and Paris, the notion of the flaneur was originally established by Walter Benjamin in Paris, also invites comparison between this play and its original source. We must also consider the timing of Marber's reimagining of the Don Juan legend. First performed in 2006, the play is decidedly post-millennial and demonstrates a complex relationship with London's past. This is revealed in the play through the position of the statue that comes to life, a late 17th century memorial, in this case, to Charles II. And hope Hope you can see that. Here is the statue as it currently stands in Soho Square today. For the remainder of this paper, it is statues that I would like us to consider. Okay, so let's think for a moment about statues. What do they communicate about the values and culture of a community? Let's think for a moment about the symbolic toppling, for example, of the Saddam Hussein statue in Baghdad in 2003 by the very people he had oppressed and persecuted. What was the point of A, building the statue in the first place, and then B, tearing it down? Alex von Tunzelmann's excellent book, Fallen Idols, provides us with analysis of many controversial and toppled statues. She argues that, and this is a quote, putting up a statue is an attempt to create a story about history, namely that a certain individual had power, importance, and influence. In the case of the Saddam Hussein statue in Baghdad, von Tunzelmann argues that, in this case, the pulling down of a statue was also an attempt to create a story about history. In this case, namely that freedom had finally arrived in Iraq after years of oppression. In reality, these stories are contested. They're myths. The ending of the statue was not in reality the ending of oppression for people in Iraq. And coalition forces had been pulling down statues of Saddam Hussein themselves since the start of the conflict. It's just that those events weren't filmed and streamed across the globe. The myth of the oppressed people rising up to end their symbolic repression by destroying a statue was just that. It was a myth. So statues and memorials represent a specific and partial view of a nation's idea of its history. It is a celebration of certain people and events to the exclusion of others, privileging a specific reading of one history over another. Michael Levenson's reading of memorials across London suggests that at the turn of the millennium, and here we return to Marber's play and the timing of Don Juan in Soho, at the turn of the millennium, London was particularly involved in reflection on these public symbols and how they can be integrated into the modern cityscape, demonstrating, quote, a newly self-conscious sense of London as a post-imperial metropolis that must now reinvent the symbols by which a community understands itself. If memorialized images represent the way in which a community, or indeed a nation, thinks about itself, these representations of national life are politically significant and potentially contentious. As London develops as a modern metropolis, its history is commodified and represented in inevitably partial images. And these feed into the ways Londoners and outsiders see and imagine the city and its past. As we have seen, images and representation of London are fraught with complexity, and Marber's play, self-consciously located at the heart of London's flamboyant centre, also grapples with multiple and imagined images of the metropolis. So why am I talking about statues? Because I want to use this keynote address as a way to argue that the recent culture wars we have seen erupting across the globe and often focused on statues is a very useful way to understand and explore the process of textual and performative adaptation in the theatre. Through exploring Don Juan in Soho, which is itself an adapted text with a statue at the heart of the drama, I would like to examine some real-life statues. I would like to examine their fates, discuss what happened to them and why, and look at the ways in which contemporary audiences, or in this case, what we might more properly term protesters, have adapted the meaning and mythology of these monuments and memorials in recent times. So in the context of Black Lives Matter in 2020, we have observed a new fascination with statues and how we can actively interact with them to assign new meanings to the histories that they have previously told. In the United States, statues of Confederate leaders have recently been removed. In fact, more than 160 of them have been removed in recent years. A statue to Robert E. Lee, for example, in New Orleans, was a rallying location for the KKK, and there were protests dating back to the early days of the civil rights movement to have it taken away. It was eventually removed in 2017, but the city employees tasked with this job had to do so in the middle of the night and wearing masks in order to protect their identities. Such was the strength of feeling on both sides. Just going to pause this for one moment and I will come back and rejoin the presentation in 1 second. Thank you.
Now the time for the episode 2.
Okay.
Sorry,
Kathleen.
I'm sharing my screen again.
Do we have to subscribe for the second part? You know, the first one was a taster for free, and now we have to pay for part 2, maybe.
It's all free.
I know.
Okay. It's the second place.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm back with you. I had a hiccup with my Wi-Fi, which is
Can you hear the
always the
presentation?
danger with remote conferencing. So apologies for that, but hopefully this second video will reach you safely and you can still hear me. So I'll go back and just recap. In the context of Black Lives Matter from 2020, we have observed a new fascination with statues and how we can actively interact with them to assign new meanings to the histories that they have previously told. In the States, statues of Confederate leaders have recently been removed, and then I spoke briefly about the statue to Robert E. Lee in New Orleans, which was finally removed in 2017 under cover of darkness and with city workers in masks and in disguise in order to remove that statue. So moving on, and apologies again for the disruption. In the UK, protest was largely focused on the statue of Edward Colston. He was a slave trader who made his fortune in Bristol, which is also the site of a statue to him in the city centre. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, intense anger was focused on this particular figure. There had already been a lengthy consultation period in the city, some people demanding the statue's removal, others raising familiar concerns about the erasure of history, and so on. There was talk about adding an additional plaque to the plinth on which the statue stands, offering historical context and explaining that Colston's vast fortune came from the death and exploitation of thousands of Black Africans, but nothing happened. Finally, in June 2020, a protest began in Bristol. The crowd tied a rope around the neck of the Colston statue and toppled it. Once it was free of its plinth, it was daubed with paint and then dragged to the harbour, from where the ships that supported and financed the slave trade had set sail, and dumped in the water. As von Tunzelmann reflects, this is a quotation from her, of those Africans transported on Colston's slave ships, 19,000 had died at sea. Their bodies were thrown into the waters. For Colston's statue, there could be no justice more poetic. The statue did not stay in the water for very long. A few days later, it was retrieved. Here is a picture now of the statue when it was removed from the water. The graffiti and the paint clearly still visible. But what should the city of Bristol do now with the statue? This has been so dramatically cut down and thrown away. Some, but not many, argued that it should be returned to its plinth. What in fact happened to it is that it was displayed in a local city museum, alongside many of the placards and banners from the protest that had seen its removal. This is how this statue can currently be seen in Bristol. This is not removed from history, not hidden or obscured, but displayed prominently alongside the stories that helped the city understand how it came to be in this state in the first place. You can clearly see the damage on the statue. No attempt has been made to restore it. Please remember this image. It's one I'll return to later. So forgive me a brief digression away from a play that doesn't come from adaptation or isn't an adaptation, but I'd like to briefly reflect on a section from Martin McDonagh's A Very, Very, Very Dark Matter, which was staged in London in 2018. In discussion about the genocide, about the genocide of up to 15 million people in the now Democratic Republic of Congo, committed by Belgium in the late 19th century, the audience hears these lines. It is a truth, a sad and sorry truth, that to this very day, all over Belgium, statues still stand to King Leopold II, always with a beard, often with a sword in his hands, never with blood on them. This image, that blood perhaps would be an appropriate addition to celebratory statues of this leader, is suggestive, I would argue, of an embellishment, of an addition to the statue that helps create new meaning. This, I intend to argue, in this keynote, is how we can think meaningfully about adaptation in the context of the culture wars. Let's return to Don Juan in Soho again for a moment, the adaptation that started me thinking about statues in the first place. So here is an image from the 2017 reprisal, the reproduction, production of the play, staged in Soho itself. And I'm not sure if you can make that out, but with David Tennant in the lead eponymous role. You can see the centrality, hopefully, in this story, in this picture. You can see the centrality of the Charles II statue upstage in this production image. We know that Marber located the play in London and in the district of Soho, more specifically, because of its reputation for louche sexuality, because of its raffish and disreputable history, and because of its high density of bars and clubs. This statue is located in the centre of Soho, in Soho Square. Charles II oversaw the layout of this square, originally called King Square, in his honour, and apparently its layout was also inspired by the French court aesthetic, thus linking Marber's play to the original Molière in another connection. We might also speculate that Charles II's reputation as both restorer and champion of theatres, as well as what might in his own time have been described as his own lax moral standards, offered Marber more resonances, even more resonances, with his selected Don Juan subject matter. In Don Juan in Soho, Marber also exploits gaps in the myth and moral ambiguity in the original play to add contemporary debates about contemporary morality, hypocrisy, and also the position and importance of social media. In transferring the play to London, he's also able to reflect on the significance of the capital as a literary creation, an unfixed geographic location subject to many multiple representations. This acquires a specifically post-millennial and post-colonial context, as Marber also uses the original play to reflect upon the importance of memorials and statues in our cityscapes as symbols of past traumas or celebrations of historical victories. These images are deeply embedded to our views of the nation and to our sense of ourselves, but they are not permanent because the intended message of the statue or the memorial can, as Jenny Edkins writes, it can change as it is seen by different generations or co-opted into new purposes. Memorials remind us that the nation state itself is not a natural or unchanging feature of our lives. In this way, the statue of the Don Juan myth, replayed in Marber's play as a statue of Charles II in Soho Square, reminds the audience of the potential for national monuments to offer alternative and fresh political and national narratives. The Charles II statue in Soho Square was once a grand and impressive tribute to a former king. It is now badly damaged and eroded. The statue is missing elements and limbs are broken. This process of wear and tear in and of itself reminds us that memorials and indeed theatrical texts are not fixed, and their physical appearance can be fundamentally changed or diminished over time. As we have seen from previous examples, statues can also be radically altered by deliberate and political acts. So let us briefly examine another Patrick Marver adaptation. After Miss Julie leaps to mind at this point. In that play, Marver adapts Strindberg's Miss Julie and transports the action of the night to the 1945 general election result, in which wartime hero Winston Churchill was beaten and replaced by a new Labour government, the government that famously introduced the National Health Service. In that play, Marver presents Churchill as a beleaguered figure. However, his image as a dominant and triumphant wartime leader was celebrated and fixed in a celebratory tone as a national monument, and most specifically, I'm thinking of the 1970s statue in Parliament Square. However, just as the statue in Don Juan in Soho is rendered literally movable, the image of this national icon can also be reinscribed. For example, during the 2000 May Day protest. And here's an image from that day, when the statue of Churchill was spray painted with red to suggest a line of blood dripping from his mouth, and a strip of green grass placed on his head to resemble a Mohican hairstyle. To return to 2020, a bad year if you happen to be a statue, the statue was covered to protect it from further attacks. So this image here, sorry, is from 2020. This is what happened to Churchill. The words racist were added to the plinth, and it had to be protected. Although many celebrate what is perceived as Churchill's wartime victory, others argue that his views on imperialism and ethnicity are deeply offensive and that he should not be literally placed upon a pedestal. Boris Johnson, British Prime Minister at the time, remarked, "It is absurd and shameful that this national monument should today be at risk of attack by violent protesters." Yes, he sometimes expressed opinions that were and are unacceptable to us today, but he was a hero and fully deserves this memorial. For many, hero and racist cannot live together in the same sentence. Perhaps such a singular definition of the concept of hero is problematic in itself. In these two occasions, the icon of the British establishment was reinterpreted, or to return to the subject of this conference, adapted by angry protesters. This process of taking a classic image and adding elements to provide a new meaning is, I argue, the same as the process of adaptation. Using an iconic image or story to help reflect a new and modern attitude or issue is what Marver has done in both of the plays explored here, albeit more respectfully to the original, layering new elements on a classic to offer the audience two alongside the other. The statue of Churchill still clearly evident, but with a new and symbolic hairstyle, demonstrating the old alongside the modern. The interpretation of the new clearly underpinned by an understanding of the old. The protesters did not obliterate the statue, rather they embellished it with new meaning and context, presenting a new way of seeing the classic icon. It is this interplay and tension between the two images, or in this case texts, that is crucial to the understanding of process of adaptation. The importance of the original placed alongside or running underneath the new context, and an appreciation that only in viewing them together can the new meaning be heard. It was this image of Churchill with the blood and the green hairstyle that was the image I mentioned right at the start of this paper as a key starting point for this keynote. It is, for me, the perfect visual depiction of textual adaptation. I invite you to recall the image of Colston in the museum in Bristol. This is not, I argue, the erasure of history, as some may claim. The statue is not hidden, thrown away, or melted down. Instead, it has been curated for a new audience in, and this is the point I most want to make today, in exactly the same way a playwright adapts a play for adaptation. The original statue is there for everyone to see. It is not hidden. We can all see that this is a statue of the slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol. And we can also clearly see the fact that it has been painted and graffitied. The two together, the original statue and the graffiti, is where the new meaning is created. In fact, the graffiti makes no sense without the visible statue lying underneath. It is in the conversation between the two where the meaning is generated and, I would argue, where the process of adaptation takes place. Let's go back and remember the lighthouse and the bridge examples I gave at the start of this talk. The later bridges and bell tower are only possible because the earlier foundations have made space for them. In the same way, I would suggest that we can only understand what the significance of Colston is for Bristolians by seeing these two images alongside each other. The statue erected to celebrate and commemorate him alongside the protest graffiti drawn on his body to tell the whole story. That his perceived greatness was only possible because of his investment in the most horrible and cruel trading of human beings. This image is adaptation in process. The coming together of the old and the new to create a new story, but a story that is only possible and meaningful if we also know the earlier foundations, the statue beneath the graffiti. These are the two images that came to my mind that I mentioned at the start of this paper that inspired me to write this keynote, exploring the synergies between statues, protests, politics, and acts of adaptation. But before I end today, I would like to briefly examine a statue with a less controversial history, although it still depicts one of the historical figures explored today. The statue I'd like to finish on is a statue of Churchill, of Winston Churchill in London, but not the upright, triumphant, military image of him as a masculine, heroic, monolithic wartime hero that we see so unproblematically presented to the public in the Parliament Square Memorial. Instead, this is a statue entitled Allies, and it depicts Churchill alongside American wartime President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And this is that statue. It was created in 1995 to celebrate 50 years of peace in London. As you can see, it is a statue that places friendship, negotiation, and collaboration at its centre. The seated position, compared to the standing and dominant statue that has been vandalised several times, humanises Churchill and his wartime effort, emphasising that communication and compromise is what secures peace, every bit as much as the shouting and the battling. Their faces demonstrate that they are perhaps sharing a joke, and that this monument is not one to wartime bluster, but instead peacetime friendship and comradeship. To return to von Tunzelmann, this is a statue that holds a place of affection for Londoners. And to quote her, it is, quote, subtle where most statues dominate. The figures are often mistaken for passers-by and for real people. It invites visitors to sit behind Churchill and Roosevelt and interact with them in any way they like, in contrast to most statues, which tower above the viewer out of reach. Indeed, I'd just like to share with you, I hope you can see this picture. This is the current image of the statue from Google Street View. We can see here a young girl posing for a photograph with her arm resting on Churchill's shoulder, as if posing for a photograph with her own family. This, I think, is why this statue has not been pulled down or vandalised. Instead of asking its audience to stand in deference to its subject, this statue invites you to see these figures as part of the cityscape, as no different and often indistinguishable from everyday Londoners and tourists. In this way, placing the audience as an equal participant and part of the performance, rather than a passive observer, ensures that history feels alive and connected to us, reminding us that historical figures need not be presented as heroic, static, or unchanging, and that enacting a fixed sense of authentic meaning that resists adaptation in order to have an important legacy. And so what are we to make of these stories of the culture wars and statues? And what is the relevance of adaptation? What is the relevance to adaptation of plays and other texts? What if we think about adaptation not as a neutral or natural translation or transformation of one text into another? What if we instead examine this process not just as an artistic or aesthetic experiment, but instead a political necessity? Let us think for a moment about how others have theorised adaptation. Julie Sanders' excellent Adaptation and Appropriation from 2016 suggests that in undertaking an adaptation, a new writer may well be driven by a, quote, political or ethical commitment, which shapes a writer, director's or performer's decision to reinterpret a source text. This commitment to re-evaluate the historical condition of an earlier text from a specifically ethical position offers us a way to understand adaptation as a response to our cultural need to re-examine and re-evaluate the narratives that are embedded within our historical pasts. To return to Sanders, she describes contemporary adaptation practice as making, quote, a particular virtue out of querying the ability or even necessity of being original. I would argue that we can also understand the process of adaptation, not only as querying the status of originality, but instead as troubling the assumed and inherent status of originality by embellishing the original with a new and contemporary position. But should we instead be iconoclastic? Adaptation, by its very nature, also serves to maintain an interest in an accepted and revered canon. Let's go back to Hutchin. If we cannot detect the repetition, we cannot appreciate or recognise that the adaptation exists, and so therefore writers are driven back to the established and recognisable canon, plundering it for their adaptations. In so doing, they are also shoring up its power and dominance. Where is the room for new stories when the canon is the default site? The political equivalent of this argument is to suggest that in examining the injustices and brutalities of the past, we should tear down the images and objects that celebrate those who perpetuated abuse and traumas in our history, obliterating their voice and refusing to include them in our new contemporary stories. These are questions and issues that are inherently and inescapably political and personal. Some will want to see statues left well alone. Some will want to see them chucked in the water and forgotten. Some will want to go to the theatre to see their favourite classics. Others will want to go and see original plays. Some people will want to do both. Adaptation in the theatre offers us, I believe, the same compromise to these binaried positions, that of a curated statue in a museum. Not obliterated or destroyed, but instead removed from a pedestal and properly and sincerely reconsidered, be that with additional plaques, banners, stories, or graffiti. Our traumatic past can be reflected upon and appropriately memorialised in this way. It is, of course, not the same thing to say that histories involving slave traders and Confederates are comparable to classic canonical plays. Of course, I am aware of the sensitivities and potential offence that could be taken in this discussion. In creating this analogy, my intention has been merely to suggest that in adapting earlier work, our contemporary playwrights are engaging with their source material in much the same way as protesters daubing a statue with paint. They are embellishing, curating, offering a new adaptation, a new interpretation, adding additional historical context. And this is how I would invite us to consider adaptation in the 21st century. So I will say thank you very much for listening, and I will stop sharing my slides, and I will say thank you for listening, and I hope you're all very much enjoying the conference and will enjoy the rest of your time together. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you in person, Catherine. Thank you for for such a presentation, which actually showed us ways in which we can use textual adaptations as a metaphor to understand and approach other acts of appropriation and adaptation in wider society. So it was quite colorful, enjoyable, insightful. Thank you again and again. The floor now is open for questions, comments. Oh, yes, Alex Sears, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Hi. And hello, Catherine.
Hi, Alex. It's really great to see you again.
And to see you too. I'm sorry to hear you haven't been, terribly well, but I hope you're feeling okay at the moment. I thought that was a very fascinating presentation. I enjoyed it very much indeed. And I've got one example to add, and perhaps to use your phrase, trouble some of your examples. It's about the statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square. You correctly showed several examples of protesters, let's call it detoning that particular statue or adapting it to a kind of protest message. I was quite interested to be in London about 3 weeks ago when there was a Free Palestine march, a very big event. You've probably heard about it, most of you, in fact. And at the same time, as well as seeing what was happening with the march, I went to Trafalgar Square because I'd heard that there were several counter-protesters, they were called. And in fact, by the time I got there, the police had sort of become quite friendly with these counter-protesters. Big, beefy, working class men, exclusively men, which is kind of interesting. And one of them, a younger, more supple one who hadn't quite been weighed down with a beer belly, managed to climb on top of the statue of Winston Churchill and attach a Union Jack, a Union flag, to the particular statue. And if you'd like to see an image of it, I direct you to my Instagram account. But apart from that, my question really is that in considering these adaptations and their politics, is there a danger that we're only really interested in the progressive adaptations that in some way echo our own prejudices or our own political views? I'm an old lefty, so obviously I'm not objecting to that, but I'm aware that there are other ways of, how shall we say, adapting public monuments that might not exactly chime with our politics. And I'm also aware that this is a complex subject. I denounced this young man who put a Union Jack on Winston Churchill as an ultra, right protester. Several of my friends pointed out, well, actually, he's just a working class boy. So it's kind of complicated when we draw, conclusions from these various acts. I just wondered, Catherine, whether you'd seen any other, let's call it adaptations of public monuments that might have a different interpretation.
Thanks, Alex. I think that's a fantastic, interesting question, and the answer to the simple answer to that is yes. I also saw that image on the news, and because I knew I was writing this paper, it was of course immediately great interest to me, and I must confess, I think, to a laziness for not including it, because I'd already prepared the slides at that point. Right. So I was like, oh, here's another great image. And had I had more time, I would have included it, actually, for the very reason that you've said, which is like why I'm also fairly old now, lefty too, like I'm obviously more sympathetic personally to some adaptations than others. And I think that we are inclined as a society to look for the meaning in the ones that we find meaningful. You know, obviously, so like we are partial in our stances as audience and protester, which I've deliberately blurred there for obvious kind of metaphorical reasons. So the answer is yes, I probably should have included that, because I think that it's a more troubling image potentially for a lot of people, and potentially and certainly a more controversial one. I think what I guess what I would say is, excuse me, that it's just an adaptation. Like what they have done with the Union flag is exactly the same really as the Mohican and the blood. Yeah. And there was a racist. Like graffiti is graffiti, adaptation is adaptation. I think I hope I've made the point that I see them all as being political. Yeah. So they are all political for me, and the meaning then is in the eye of the beholder, essentially. So, you know, your understanding of that interpretation depends on how you personally feel about Israel and Palestine and the counter protest, which you know, I think a lot of us found really unpleasant and difficult to watch. But then I think we all need to think why we feel the way that we do when we see those kind of embellishments. And I guess the other thing I would say is, for me, what's important is the juxtaposition of those two images. So like I'm sure a lot of them were holding flags. I'm sure a lot of the people on that protest were wearing iconography that's associated with the flag of the Union, or possibly the St. George flag as well, which is even more controversial. Yeah. What is the interesting thing for me is the fact that they put it on top of Churchill. Like they've appropriated the use of Churchill and everything that he means to the world and to this country specifically, in order to say something very specific about how they feel about the political climate at the time. So in terms of adaptation, it is only in the way that you embellish or stick a flag literally on top of something that for me the whole meaning can really come out. Does that answer your question? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you for both of you. Any more questions or any comments? Any? No? Okay. In that case, we'll start the next concurrent sessions at 6:30. So once again, thank you, Catherine, for coming and joining us and for this very influential presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again. Okay.
Thank you, Nazan Hocam, for chairing this event, and thank you, dear Dr. Catherine Rees, for this amazing talk, and thank you, Alex, for this interesting question that attracts our attention. Thank you so much.
Well, we're going to go with our sessions. We have 2 parallel sessions in 5 minutes. And as you might know, we have 2 separate bilateral rooms. So in the room 1 and the room 2. So we're going to meet in the rooms. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Dr. Nazan Tutaş.
Thank you. Thank you all for such a good event. Thank you. See you in the rooms.
Our pleasure. Thank you.